By the way, loved your text. Yannis Hamilakis is an archaeologist and professor of modern Greek studies at Brown University. He has researched and published on archaeology of the body and of the senses, politics of the past, decolonial archaeology, archaeological ethnography, photography, and archaeology as collateral devices of modernity and on the materiality of contemporary migration. He has published books such as Archaeology and the Senses, Human Experience, Memory, and Artifact, Camera Calauria, and Archaeological Photoethnography, The Sacred Ruins of Modernity, Coloniality, Archaeology and National Imagination in Greece and Israel. He's the co-director of the Cultural Magala Archaeology and Archaeological Ethnography project focused on the exploration of an important Hello site in Central Greece. Since 2016, he has been investigating the materiality of contemporary migration on the border island of Lesbos as an academic and activist project. He has curated and co-curated a series of exhibitions at Brown University. Good evening, Professor Yannis. We thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be here with us in our conference. We are very glad to have you here once more. Your participation is very important for us, as you have been with us previously as well. You are most welcome. And Professor Yannis will discuss archaeology in and at present. You can ask questions on the chat or wherever you like. And let's hear from Professor Yannis. I would just like to remind you of this. After our conference, we will have a brief closing session. And so after Professor Yannis' presentation, please remain on the room. Professor, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody. I'm very, very glad to be with you, even if it's virtually. So I want to start by thanking you for the kind invitation to deliver this closing speech to your conference. I have tried to attend some of the proceedings in the midst of a very heavy week for me, and I am once more deeply impressed by the broad range of themes you've covered, by the richness of your thinking, and by the astute critique of the coloniality of power and knowledge in archaeology. I've said this to you before, but every time I attend a conference in South America, whether it's in the meetings of your association or a thematic workshop or a meeting of TAS, Teoría Arqueológica de la América del Sur, I feel I return home having learned much more than I was able to offer to you as insights based on my own work. Next semester at my own university, at Brown University, I'm going to teach with a colleague a graduate seminar called The Colonial Matters Thinking from the South. And while we're defining the South, mostly not geographically, but mostly epistemologically and politically, I have no doubt that it will feature some of the work that you have been doing and producing in Brazil and in South America in general. At the same time, I'm aware of my positionality as a white male professor working at an elite university in the settler colony that we now call the USA. The inequities in the production and dissemination of knowledge are well known, and we have to be constantly aware of them. Now, while we communicate right now through an online platform, it is important to acknowledge that we are physically situated, grounded, and that grounding is never free from power inequities and the long durational effects of colonization. I'm speaking to you from the city of Providence, the city which was established by white settlers in what it eventually became the colony of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. But the land I'm standing on at this moment is the unceded land belonging to the Narragansett and Wampanoag people, people who are still around and fight for their sovereignty. And as many of you know, let me just share my screen for just for 1 second to share my screen. I apologize. And as many of you know, I originally come from Greece, a country of the European South and of the Mediterranean, a country that was produced at the intersection of colonialism and nationalism, the outcome of the crypto-colonized effects of Western European powers starting in the late 18th and early 19th century. The ideas of Orientalized and racialized Western Hellenism, that is, the ideological apparatus that constructed an ideal version of ancient classical Greece and declared it as the golden age of the West, were instrumental in this process of crypto-colonization. And here you see an image from 1801, supposed to represent Greece as it emerges out of ruins, as you can see, classical ruins, and you can see a papyrus at her feet saying Homeros, Homer. And of course, the figure of the Oriental barbarian who is keeping this female figure enslaved. The nation state that emerged in the 1830s was involved itself in various processes of crypto-colonizing, showing once more that it is the broader condition of coloniality that produces colonial effects, and that sometimes you can be both colonized and colonizer at the same time. Last time I spoke to your association, it was at the regional meeting, the SAB Southeast at Uro Preto in October 2018. It was a different moment then. It was a few days before the Brazilian election, and all of our minds were focused on the unfolding events. The title of that presentation was Archaeology, Neo-Fascism, and White Supremacy, Decolonizing Our Theories, Engaging in Practices of Resistance. Much has happened since, some dramatic and disturbing, some hopeful. The rise of neo-fascist regimes in many parts of the world, the global pandemic, which accelerated social inequalities, and the continuing climate emergency on the one hand, and the defeat of some powerful white supremacist leaders, for example, in this country, and the global insurrection against white supremacy, spearheaded by the Black Lives Matter movement on the other. So there is gloom, but there is also hope. This time, you asked me to talk about archaeology in the present. I have accepted the challenge, but I have slightly modified the title. So my title is Archaeology in and of the Present. Two different but interrelated facets that connect archaeology with what we call the present, a temporal dimension which is far from self-evident and uncomplicated. I will spend the first part of my talk speaking about what it means to carry out archaeology in the present, while the second will attempt to respond to how we can engage in an archaeology of the present. And I will do so by offering a specific example. This is a good moment to take stock of what several decades of archaeological reflection, critical historiography, and engagement with the politics of the discipline have shown us. It is time to connect the work on the politics of the discipline with the work on the alternative and indigenous archaeologies, taking place both in the global south and in the margins and the peripheries of the global north. The exploration of the genealogy of modernist archaeology has shown it to be one of the many devices of racialized, colonial, patriarchal, and capitalist modernity. An archaeology that was constructed as an anthropocentric discipline, grounded on the regime of autonomous vision. But the combining of this work with the work on alternative and indigenous archaeologies will have a dual effect. The first is the demolishing and the abandonment of the archaeology as we know it, as we have been taught to practice it. A discipline that is based on the separation between past and present, on linear and progressive developmental time and temporality, on commodification, and on essentialist categories such as culture and race. But the second effect will be to construct a new undisciplined discipline, to evoke Alejandro Haber, another set of archaeologies in the plural, openly political, radical, hybrid, and nomadic. The critique of cultural history and new archaeology by the broad movement known as post-processualism or post-processual archaeologies will no longer suffice. It's no longer enough. And in any case, it has been already co-opted by capital and by various establishment institutions. Multivocality or diversity is now the language of neoliberal capitalism. And some of the major global corporations, which are instrumental in destroying the planet and life on Earth, are very happy to sponsor and support cutting-edge theoretical work, such as the one that had taken place as part of the major project at Çatalhöyük in Anatolia in Turkey, directed by Ian Hodder, and sponsored, as we know, by the Shell oil company, by the Visa credit card, and by many other corporations. A reconstitution of an undisciplined discipline, however, entails a radical change on the way we think and do archaeology in the present. Now, there has been talk of radical change or even revolution in archaeology for some time now. But this seems to come mostly from people who advocate for and work on scientific applications to archaeology. Think of the influential 2014 paper, for example, by Christian Christensen on what he called the third science revolution. Christian claims that we are undergoing an exciting time because we are experiencing a dramatic change brought about by the possibilities of science advances and their application to archaeology. Isotopic analysis, aDNA, digitization, big data, and so on. But do these really signify a change of paradigm? Archaeology has always incorporated the latest technical advances. After all, one of the first uses of the medium of photography, which was invented in 1839, was the recording of archaeological monuments and sites. And throughout its professional history, modernist archaeology was quick to make the most of the latest advances, whether it was botanical and zoological methods of analysis or the invention of computers. I cannot see how this on its own can be a shift of paradigm. On the contrary, I see huge problems in elevating the latest technical advance to the status of potentially revolutionary change. A technical advance, irrespective of its theoretical underpinnings and the framework within which it has been deployed. As for the advances brought about by the so-called third science revolution, it has already been shown how sometimes it can be politically as well as epistemically problematic. Let's take one example to illustrate my point, and that example is the ancient DNA applications. Now, and this, by the way, is discussion I develop in the book that is going to come out in a few months, that we talk about archaeology, nation, and race in Greece and in Israel. Talk of how DNA studies can change everything is everywhere these days. We hear it, in the media as well as in many archaeological publications and studies. And books such as this one that you see on the slide by David Reich, Who We Are and How We Got Here, set the tone of much of the discussion. David Reich is a director of Harvard University's Ancient DNA Lab, perhaps the most powerful center in archaeogenetics in the world right now, and one which has been heavily critiqued for its aggressive and expansive policies in sourcing archaeogenetics data. Now, the title of the book and the preface give the game away. Our idea was, the author writes, to make DNA industrial, to build an American-style genomics factory. So note the terms, both American-style and genomics factory. Your DNA will tell you who you are, this book claims, and it will write your history, the history of humanity. You don't need to know details, not so much our methods. They're too complicated anyway. Now, this black boxing of the scientific analytical process adds to the mystified and authoritative status of science. It is this mystification which the social anthropologist Stéphane Palmier has called racecraft. Think of the term racecraft, witchcraft is another term, racecraft. This is what Palmier writes with reference to DNA testing, a lot of which can also apply to archaeogenetics. And I quote, "The function of DNA testing is a divinatory practice, designed to visualize and give materiality by evidentiary proxy to entities whose ontological characteristics include the crucial feature of invisibility." In other words, because of the invisibility of genes, mystification becomes accentuated and exaggerated and covers much of the buzz around ancient DNA. And while ancient DNA work can produce interesting archaeological results, especially at the micro scale, in exploring, for example, genetic connections amongst the inhabitants of a community or neighboring communities, most archaeogenetic studies, and the ones that they have received the most public attention, operate at a very large scale, work within an interpretive framework of what is called mass migrations. They return to the notion of culture as a bounded, essentialist, ahistorical entity, which is transplanted from place to place through population movement and also through population replacement, which is the other term that is being used. For example, in the same book, the book by Reich, we read that, I quote, "We discovered that the population of Northern Europe was largely replaced by a large migration from the Eastern European steppe," end of quotation. Note the language here and recall how white supremacists today speak of the danger of replacement of white Europeans by colored people. Equally problematic is the use in this work of various ethnonyms. There is no acknowledgement of the rich anthropological discussion on ethnicity, and labels such as, for example, in my own area of study, Minoans, Mycenaeans, or Phoenicians stand for discrete, ethnically homogeneous cultures, reminiscent of the cultural history approach we all know of the 18th and 19th century, and of the figure of Gustave Cousinat, who is known to all undergraduate archaeology students as the 19th and early 20th century German diffusionist and nationalist archaeologist who proposed an isomorphic relationship between material culture and ethno-national identity. His ideas and their clear racial connotations, which formed the basis of the fascist and Nazi archaeology of the 20th century, were widely influential until recently. Now, while on the decline, these ideas, they seem to have found a new lease of life in archaeogenetics research, powered by sophisticated but black box analytical methodologies. And while a lot can be said of the specific facets of such methodologies, from sample size to the naming of the social units that these samples represent, to the role of the archaeologists in these studies, who are mostly the suppliers of samples, not the contributors to interpretation, the huge lacuna, the huge gap, the huge problem is to do with a theoretical naivete evident in most such studies. In addition to the points above, we could perhaps add two more. The lack of any reflection on kinship, and on human relationality, which, as Marshall Salins and others have shown, are mostly to do with the mutuality of being, not any genomic connection seen purely as a biological given. And the equally astonishing contempt for the abundant studies which have shown that the genes themselves are shaped by relationality and the histories, and are based on and give rise to multiple assemblages of beings, some organic and some not, some human and some not. They are not isolated, autonomous entities with no histories of their own. They cannot be understood within a framework of binary separation between nature and culture. In other words, human DNA is not purely human DNA, but a hybrid, heterogeneous assemblage, a snapshot of our connections and relationships with plants and animals, other humans, and with life in the world. In a sense, the problem, one of the key problems with the discipline of modernist archaeology is a problem of colonization, of its colonization. Now, decolonization is the word of the moment, both in this country and around the world, in archaeology and elsewhere in academia. We know that. But decolonization is not a metaphor. It will have to be both broad and specific at the same time, countering the ideological, but also the material colonizing forces, including race, nation, and capital. Archaeology and academia are only two specific arenas in which we should be acting, but it's important to see this work as one facet of the global decolonizing movement, which, as I mentioned, gained new vitality and force during the 2020 global anti-racist uprising. And we can gain inspiration, theoretical and methodological insights, and encouragement and support from that movement. Interestingly and crucially for us, this anti-racist movement has identified statues, monuments, and sites of commemoration as key focal points and as localities that embody and perpetuate white supremacy. And here you see a statue of General Lee, General of the Confederacy, at Richmond, Virginia, which was one of the key foci for various demonstrations, activities, and interventions in that specific statue. The activists and the public who have been protesting around and modifying such sites recognize the histories of forgetting that underpin their making. And they can see clearly how monuments have been weaponized. They've become weapons in the ongoing battles around race and nation. For me, the decolonial process starts with a reflexive moment, the moment of realizing that you've been colonized, that everything you do, by you I mean all of us, that everything you do within archaeology, operating within the specific modernist regime, a specific national colonial regime, is part of the long process of colonizing ideas, knowledge, language, our own language, but also institutions and practices. And we have to remember that the broader regime of modernist archaeology has been shaped by specific ideas about the body, about time and experience, and domineering binaries such as subject and object, or nature and culture, or even past and present, or past versus present. These binaries have colonized our imagination and shaped our thoughts and actions. Modernist archaeologists, for example, have bought into notions of temporal linearity, exemplified by our stratigraphic sequences, and are accustomed to separate past and present and dichotomy with important consequences on how we see our role, our relationship with communities today, but also on how we tell stories about what we call the past. I put it to you that the building of new, openly political, radical, and nomadic archaeologists will need to be grounded not on one, but on three epistemic, ontological, and political paradigm shifts, which they are closely linked. There are three, but they are interconnected. Let me outline them briefly for us today. The first has to do with the chronopolitics of archaeology, And by that, I mean the way we perceive time, our sense of temporality is laden with political effects. We are grounded on the separation, as we just mentioned, between past and present, and on linear, progressive, and developmental time. This slicing of time, this metaphor of temporal experience as a train journey, or the time's arrow idea, has been by now, as we know, heavily critiqued in philosophy, in anthropology, and in history, but also in some archaeological writings. And colleagues in Brazil and in South America have been some of the pioneers in trying to critique that chronological kind of chauvinism and that chronological effect in archaeology, the chronopolitics of archaeology. But we, archaeologists of all people who deal with matter and with things, should be the first to ditch linearity. Matter embodies duration. We know that from philosophy, from Bergson, from Deleuze, and from others. It enacts different temporal moments simultaneously, not in succession. I'm not talking about diachrony and continuity here, because both these concepts, diachrony and continuity, are tropes which are embedded in linearity. I'm talking about multi-temporality as the coexistence of different times. What we call the present is a fragile consensus, as some historian colleagues have recently put it. A silent clash, they call it, they say. The present is always haunted by different pasts, and it also entails different temporal regimes which often clash. Linearity very often clashes with multitemporality, hence the fragility of the present. That's what I mean when I and others say that colonialism and colonization has not ended, that coloniality as a condition is still present. That's what I mean when we say, I say, and others say that the current migration movement from the global south to the global north embodies the return of the colonized. We are here because you were there is the saying. It is the latest episode in the long history of extractive colonization of the earth, starting with early modernity, and that migrants, or better, people on the move, which is the expression I prefer, embody a living history. They enact in a profound way time as coexistence, as duration. The political effects of the perception of time based on tradition of linearity and progressivism, and on the radical separation of past and present, are less well understood and discussed, but they should be. Escapism, insulation from what we call the present is one effect. Being oblivious to the political impact of archaeology in the present today is another effect. Or refusal to appreciate the haunting potential of past processes and events, the lasting and ever-present impact of the long living histories of violence, for example, is a further effect. Now, linearity and progressivism, as I said, in archaeology have received serious blows in recent years from developments such as the archaeology of the contemporary or the archaeology of the contemporary past, and archaeological ethnography, which is both fields that I'm actively engaged and have contributed to. But not all stands and all research in these areas appreciate the ontological effects, the radical shift that these new directions entail in removing, in effect, the archaeo from the word archaeology. So archaeology without the archaeo is something that I think we are aspiring towards. The second paradigm shift upon which these new archaeologies are grounded is to do with the body politics of modernist archaeology, the body politics. By that I mean the reliance on Western modernist archaeology upon the conception of the bounded, autonomous, and individuated body. More often than not, a male body, and one which operates within the Western sensorium of the five senses, seen mostly as separate, organic, and biological processes. External stimuli are internally processed under this framework and thought through by the mind, resulting in responses by the body. This external-internal model, this Cartesian body politic, is responsible for the vision-oriented heritage of modernist archaeology and its elevation into a supreme sense, and for the acceptance and internalization of the broader mind-body dichotomy. Bodily and sensorial hierarchies are often mapped into gender and racial hierarchies, while at the same time, certain senses are seen as features and attributes of animality, reinforcing further the anthropocentrism of Western modernist archaeology. And I have developed these ideas, as some of you know, in my book, Archaeology and the Senses, which has been also translated in Spanish. In that book, I have developed a proposal for a multisensorial and synesthetic archaeology. I have been also advocating for the importance of affect as a shared space, a sensorial field, a space in between where emotions are collectively generated and felt. I have also argued in that book for transcorporeality, which is produced through shared, collective, sensorial and affective encounters beyond the individuated and bounded body. Finally, the third paradigmatic shift, which is needed, is to do with the politics of storytelling and developmental narratives in archaeology. For many years, we knew that storytelling about the human past based on the cultural evolutionist framework was problematic, more a fiction of specific archaeological anthropological models than an empirically validated reality. Data were accumulating for decades now all over the world, from the Amazon to Anatolia and the Middle East, showing that the conventional narratives on the origins of agriculture, on the emergence of the cities, and more or pertinently the emergence of what we call the state, or the origins of inequality, are plainly wrong. These fictions project a linear developmental story, a march of progress towards complexity and sophistication, ending with Western democracy and with neoliberal capitalism, at which point it seemed that progress stopped because we reached the best of possible worlds. Now, data that expose these fallacies were all over the archaeological and anthropological literature for decades, as I said. Data that showed, for example, that for thousands of years, people were experimenting with plants and animals, and they still do, prior to the establishment of what we call agriculture. And there are fantastic and interesting data coming out of Brazilian archaeology, especially with the new word in the Amazon by a number of colleagues. But it is this book, which was published in the past few weeks in Britain and in the US by the late David Graeber, the anthropologist, and David Wengrow, the archaeologist, which gathered such a rich body of archaeological and anthropological data, as well as indigenous thinking and accounts from the Americans mostly, to propose a simple argument that a different, non-teleological narrative about the past, an open-ended story of humanity, is not only empirically grounded, but also liberating for us today. If there are so many and diverse forms of social organization and material life in the past, if there is no predetermined path, things could still be otherwise. The world can still change. Now, I would like now to move to my second part of the paper and change tone, become more personal in some ways and less academic in others, and present an archaeology of the present based on the work on contemporary migration in the Mediterranean. Some of you know I've been doing this for many years, and I gave some kind of presentation at the Europreto conference a few years ago. And more specifically, as you know, I work on the island of Lesbos, which is on the border between Turkey and Greece. A border which is in fact a border also of the European Union, not just the country of Greece and Turkey, a border of the European Union, but also a border, a global border, a border between the global south and the global north. This border is a fault line. And sustained attention to that border, to what's happening in that border, I believe it can be very revealing in many different ways. Many scholars work there already, social anthropologists, human geographers, political scientists. There is already much published out there on Lesbos and on migration on Lesbos, but I felt that an archaeology of border crossing based on Lesbos was lacking. This is curious because border crossing is also, or perhaps primarily, a material, a sensorial, and kinesthetic phenomenon, that is an experiential phenomenon of the moving body, and leaves material effects, material correlates. And it's also a phenomenon with very strong and clear temporal dimensions. So both the material and the temporal and the sensorial are actually expressed in that movement and border crossing. It is thus my conviction that an archaeology of contemporary border crossing cannot just help us understand migration, but given the significance of global migration today for the world right now, a phenomenon that is reshaping our world, an archaeological take on migration can provide an oblique take on the present condition as a whole, but also on the long durational unfinished histories which hold together, but only barely, the fragile consensus we call the present. So my point is that an archaeology of contemporary migration is not just about migrants or border crossings, it's about every one of us, and can actually speak to the world today beyond the theme of migration, the phenomenon of migration. One of my key sites for this work is the camp of Moria, which I was monitoring, observing, visiting, and living with since April 2016. The camp became notorious for its size, housing in early 2020 more than 20,000 people when the facilities could barely cope with 3,000. It also became notorious for the cruel conditions that people had to suffer while there. This camp, by the way, was completely burned down by a huge fire that raged for 3 days in September 2020 in the midst of the COVID crisis. And I want to show you 2 slides showing the development of this space. From the top left, when it was just a conscript, Greek conscript army camp, to its foundation as a migrant camp, top right, and then bottom you could see the gradual sprawling and enlargement and expanding out of that camp, first inside a walled fence and then outside that fence. And then you could see the further sprawling on the very top. And then the bottom on the left, you could see the camp just after the fire in September 2020. And then on the bottom right, you could see it in November 2020 when the first stages of erasure had actually started. You could see that parts of it was being erased, and now more of it, or most of it, has been erased by local authorities, by government authorities, and other agents. Moria was many things at once. Once a training center, as I said, for conscripts of the Greek army, it was developed as a migrant camp in 2013, but one which included several components: apparatuses for capturing and extracting information, for detention, for humanitarian support and asylum processing, but also for shelter, for inhabitation. It was not a prison. Yet detention was part of its role, for some people all of the time, and for all people some of the time. Inside it, there was a closed facility called pre-departure detention center. That is, people who were about to be deported were in prison, locked up there. It was a surveillance and documentation apparatus, a huge logistical operation for capturing data, but it was an incomplete one nevertheless, as the official census following the fire showed 2,000 people missing, which meant that they managed to continue their journey. It was also an apparatus of classification, labeling, grouping, and segregation. But even so many of its inhabitants managed to forge links across national, ethnic, gender, and other boundaries and continue their journey regardless. It was an institution of schooling in the bodily pedagogy of submission, yet protests and demonstrations were frequent. It was a settlement which in its last phase came to resemble a camp city, but one with an arrested urbanity, or rather urbanity in suspension, the kind of urbanity that only people on the move could build. It was a material monument to a failing policy, a ruin to be, a ruin in waiting, the ruination of which had been foretold several times over in the camp revolts and in small and bigger fires that had erupted prior to the final one. And it was much more than these partially fragmentary answers could indicate. Now, I visited Moria a few days after the fire, and I recorded in photography and in notes my feelings surveying that ruin, that archaeological site of the present. A couple of months later, I wrote a photo essay based on that visit, and I'm going to read out to you from that photo essay some passages to convey, I hope, that sense of visiting a modern archaeological site, an archaeological ruin of contemporary migration, and a ruin of a ruined policy as well. It was the silence that I mostly recall from that day, the early October day of 2020 when I visited the ruins of Moria. The uncanny and strange silence of a place that I remember so alive and so full of buzz. January 2020 was when I was here last. I was then last. The soundscape then was very different. I recall the winter sun. I still hear the sound of an axe falling on an olive tree. It was a rare sunny interval in the midst of the winter, and people were out chopping firewood. Children were out too, playing, their voices still in my ears. I recall how stunned I was then when I realized the extent of the Moria settlement. It had covered not only the area called the Olive Grove or jungle, called by migrants jungle, but also every hill around it. It had even nearly reached the area where asylum seekers from Central Africa, Christians, used to find refuge, their own mound of olives, to perform their ceremonies, to send to the skies their chanting. It was a peaceful place up there, back in 2017. but not so in late 19 and 20. Now, instead of chopped firewood and children's voices, mostly silence. Silence which was punctuated, however, by strange noises, dog noises, cat noises. I then remember that the settlement of 20,000 people had attracted many strayed cats and dogs. And I recall that they were fed by the inhabitants. They shared in some of the food their human neighbors struggled to prepare every day. They also often enjoyed the lion's share from the camp food prepared by the subcontractor catering company that was mostly rejected by humans as they found it inedible. The millions of that centralized food provision contract ill spent, the mountains of wasted food, the animals that it attracted from nearby, the migration industry and its multi-species entanglements. I know for a fact that of those cats and dogs, some had been adopted by asylum seekers themselves. Strong bonds had been created, echoing Manus Islands and its dogs as has been described in the stories of Behrouz Boochani, the well-known Afghani migrant in Manus Islands, Kurdish Afghan. Some of these animals must have been left with the Maori inhabitants in those terrible nights and days of September when they gathered what they could and abandoned the burning camp. But most animals stayed behind. They belong to the place. They have been here hungry for almost a month now, and they were wandering around. The barking was penetrating, sad and terrible. I hear that some asylum seekers and people from the town were touched by their plight and they came back here to feed them. But it's not enough, and it has been almost a month. Suddenly, as we were walking the cement road up the hill on the eastern side, we heard loud noises and saw inside the fenced compound a pack of angry dogs chasing ferociously and frightened cats in and out of the burned and ravaged containers. They're going to kill her. They're going to eat her, G said, agitated, and rushed to chase them away. And what happened to that bird that was kept in this burned cage? But there were human voices too. Occasionally, a group of young people, most likely volunteers in migrant support NGOs, would wander like us amongst the ruins and stop and comment at specific spots. A heritage space already? No, more likely a landscape of ruination suspended between two temporal states, a landscape going through the time of agony, as Alfredo Ruibal Gonzalez has called it. Not a living site, nor a mummified heritage locale either. A space of agony, space going through the time of agony. What is to happen to this place? If the government authorities have their way, it will become a park. So the urbanite conservative prime minister said, or it will be planted again with olive trees, so another politician said, local politician. Erasure by nature seems to be the site's fate, desired by people in high places, forgetting perhaps the persistence and resilience of material memory. But there were other human voices too around, more animated, from people oblivious to our presence, hard at work, eager to get going. A large group of men, women, and children, many possibly from the Roma community, but not only, coming to take things away, to scavenge for scrap metal and other usable and recyclable things. They were working primarily inside the wall compound, where most metal could be found. The meager materials of the encampment around the main compound was mostly wood, stone, plastic sheets, and tarp, and water bottles, and they were of less interest to them. They wanted to show me the new location of the school and the art studio operated by the Wave of Hope for the Future, a small Afghani organization that I had visited, and I also collaborated with in the making of an exhibition called Transit Matter, which you can actually still see online in the link I provided. I recall my last visit to the school, the community library, and the studio, crammed in the jungle between closely spaced habitation tents and the mosque. And by the way, this is the painter in that studio, Shukran Shehzad from Afghanistan, who still paints in the new location. Later in 2020, I saw in their Facebook post that they had actually building a new, larger school and art studio in an area behind the walled compound. It tells me that it was because movement on the ground, a major NGO, was in charge of the first area, the olive grove, and the jungle area, and they wanted them out. That big NGO wanted them out. As we reached the spot, the traces were unmistakable. A large pile of white ash where the library was, many burned acrylic paints and tubes, and metal cases containing paintbrushes where the art studio stood, and the large rectangular empty space where the school rooms were. As I was walking on, I realized that we are now gaining access to areas and spaces that we, white men, locals of sort, could never possibly have had while the camp was in operation. I had been inside tents a couple of times, cordially invited by their inhabitants, but we could mostly sit at the courtyard outside or in communal areas, talk and share food when the camp was in operation, that is. Now, we could walk into any space, and it felt wrong. It felt voyeuristic at times. In most cases, however, we did not have to enter an enclosed space, especially in the areas outside the wall compound. Now, the area was mostly a vast open-air ruin, an archaeological site with the walls and the roofs of the structures missing, but with the layout and the foundations intact. A perfect site plan to read. The canonical rectangular shape of the wooden pallets laid out on the floor for drainage gave the landscape the features of an urban grid, designed according to the principles of the hypodamian system in antiquity. Features that were not known to an outside observer now were revealing themselves to us. Interior hearths, sunken pits, enclosed outdoor toilets, laid interior floors, and sleeping platforms. It was as if the place became more readable, better understood as a ruin. The objects, the ruined structures, the humble materials were revealing themselves now in their gutted, more intimate, raw state. In a way, these were stories in wood and stone and plastic, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a directly physical, material, tangible, and experiential sense. Stories that were not spoken by the inhabitants, they were not uttered because they were not meant to be. Their purpose was endurance and survival. Shelters had to be built and hearths and ovens constructed. Interiors organized in the most inventive and ingenious sense, given the shortage of space. Cooking and eating for sustenance, for memory, for self-affirmation, for self-dignity, for community had to be arranged. Material stories about labor, discrimination, and resilience. Material stories about fear and violence too. For example, the makeshift toilets dug on the ground in and around tents, visible and exposed now in this ruinous landscape, speak of the lack of proper sanitation. But they also speak of the fear that women in particular and other vulnerable groups felt in walking, especially at night, to a few poorly maintained and poorly lit toilets provided by the authorities. Stories of earth and stone and wood, stories of bodied in segregation. To be sure, writing was done too, not just building things. Painting, as we saw, music, and even short films were produced by migrants while there. But this landscape of ruins is the most effective and evocative story of all, painful and fascinating at the same time. Now, they want to show me the stone theater built by volunteers in an area that was meant to be for play and children's activities. But then something else catches our eye. A series of identical wooden shacks clearly marked with blue paint and numbered, some complete, some half-built. A paper sign on one of the doors says, "Discard PPE before entering." So I don't have that. Discard PPE before entering. So this is a COVID isolation clinic, the construction of which was interrupted by the fire. Greece as a whole went through various lockdowns, still going on, various lockdowns and reopenings since March 2020. But this camp, Moria, along with other migrant camps, was in complete and permanent lockdown and strict quarantine since then. So people were actually contained further because of the lockdown of COVID. Its residents were not allowed to move out of it, even for their basic shopping. The camp stayed free of COVID until the end of the summer 2020, and then 6 days before the fire, the first confirmed case was announced. A Somali man who was allowed to travel to the mainland, left for Athens, but returned a month later, unable to find support in Athens. He was not the only one. Hundreds of them were forced to return. They wanted to return to Lesbos. Moria was a hell for its inhabitants, but better the hell they knew, and the one where they could find communal effort, self-organizing, and volunteer support. Soon after these first cases, COVID cases were multiplied. According to media reports and the locators I talked to, one possible scenario for the fire, for why the fire started, it was that the authorities wanted to remove infected people to a warehouse nearby, and they resisted that removal. They wanted to go to a proper hospital as everybody else, not to a warehouse. And hence tensions, hence the fire. Anthropilla did matter, Greek word meaning the order of humanness. My colleague who was with me said, "I can smell the order of humanness." This palpable ruin was clearly too intense, too real, and too affectively close. He felt that overwhelming affective power of this space. As we walked, we passed the baker's quarter of sorts, the area where the sunken bread ovens were constructed by Afghani and other Middle Eastern migrants. And then we decided to enter the world compound, the area that was more controlled when the camp was on operation. It was controlled by the police, by the army, by the private agencies like the group S4, as well as by NGO volunteers. It is a strange feeling that we can walk around in and out of the containers and office buildings between razor-wide fences and ominous signs uninhibited. But the burned materiality here affects us all in different ways. Wood and stone and plastic outside, deformed metal, shattered glass, and tossed down office furniture here. This is more brutal, uglier. This is more brutal and uglier. And the layers and layers of razor-wide are undestructible, blackened at times, but its punitive, bloody potential still there. Now, the offices of the Reception and Identification Center abandoned in haste. Metal filing cabinets overturned, loose papers all over. Amongst them, handwritten transcripts from interviews with migrants. In this own case, not this one, but the case I'm describing, taken by the Red Cross interviewing F, a woman from Cameroon, 29-year-old woman from Cameroon, asylum seekers, interviewed in 2017, who traveled through Guinea and Turkey, and who speaks French and Spanish, and who declared Greece as her desired destination. Then a detailed social history, written in blue ball pen, narrating death, imprisonment, and sexual violence. A life in fragments, scattered amongst the ruins. This was on a piece of paper, as I said, that I found on the soil. These interviews would have probably been transferred into digital form, or maybe the case was resolved one way or another, or both. But a life deemed of lesser importance, hence Moria. A narrated life, the interview, narrated life on paper, left behind by the authorities, exposed, not worthy of collection, protection, or curation. I have been in this office before. It was 2017 during a short conversation with the commander-in-chief of the camp. I recall this notice board that he used to record every day the number of people, this whiteboard. This bureaucratic logic, desperate to map, account, categorize, maintain an illusion of control. And you could see the main nationalities listed on this board. Afghani 77%, Syrian 8%, and so on. Yet, after the fire, as I mentioned already, the tally would not match, with as many as 2,000 people missing. In the unaccompanied migrant sector, scattered educational materials on the floor, and a short guide on a prehistoric site of Thermio in Lesbos. Was this guide provided by the teachers of these children? Was it picked up in one of the rare excursions on the archaeological site? We cannot tell. The vandalized ATM machine inside the camp was installed only a few months before the fire, since because of the COVID crisis and the lockdown in the camp, people could no longer go to the town and withdraw the little money that the United Nations actually offered them. In front of the asylum service building, which is this one, which had been blazed more than once in the past in revolts and uprisings, I remember seeing groups of people with papers at hand pushing against the razor-wide entrance. Now, at long last, I had the chance to inspect this fence from up close. It is only now that I realized that it was a double fence, creating a cordon sanitaire, a buffer zone of sorts in the middle, and that it was only through this small rectangular opening that asylum seekers were able to push the papers through, minimizing any intimate bodily contact. I was writing these lines from Athens a few months after October 2020, and the day before I was writing, I had seen this poster on a wall in Athens, mentioning Moria even as a ruin, especially as a ruin travels. And what you see here is a text from the lyrics of a song by a punk and rap group called Grab Boca, sung in French and Greek. Struggles are my friends' homeland. They draw their future in the ashes of Moria, it says. Damascus, Aegean, hotspot, Athens, central square of Victoria. We carry stories and thorns in our feet, the lyrics go, and maybe we could listen to for 1 second of the song, because I think we all need some music right now.
Ces militants sont considérés comme susceptibles de participer à des contestations violentes. C'est pour cela qu'ils sont sous surveillance. Leur communication et leurs déplacements sur les zones de manifestation sont attentivement scrutés. Αντανακλάσεις από κόκκινο και μπλε στις γειτονιές μας. Το κράτος ετοιμάζει τις φυλές μας. Οι μπάτσοι στις πλατείες, αστέγια και στις σχολές μας εκενώνουν. Αλλά θα τους τυχιώνουν οι γραφιές μας. Παιδιά της κρίσης, με πόνους στα πόδια και καταθλίψεις. Με εξώσεις, κλητεύσεις και απολύσεις. Αφράγγι με συνειδήσεις που στείλουν τις παρέτησεις και τη φόλα. Οι πρώτες σταγόνες από την πόρα.
I think it's enough because we are running out of time, but you get a sense of the energy that this song that evoked this ruined calm and emits. And I think the title of my photo essay is taken from that kind of song about how they draw their future in the ashes of Moria, the ashes becoming the drawing ground upon which they plan their future journey. And I want to skip the last paragraph and in fact go to the conclusions and give you with this image. So I wanted to finish with this image, which is a word by an Argentinian artist, Gabriel Chailé, the name of the artist. And I saw this image a couple of days ago at the museum in New York, the new museum, and you can recognize the source of inspiration, the pottery that this kind of work comes from, that is pottery from Catamarca area in Argentina. The title of this work is Mama Luchona. The artist claims that this represents for him the mother for all his work. But as we know, the phrase can have many other connotations, including being a tribute to single mothers who fight and who do not give up. But I found this appropriate for our discussion today. My title, Archaeologia do Presente, without the do, can also be read differently. Archaeologia Presente, present archaeology, or archaeologies which respond to the calling of the moment of danger and emergency we're going through right now. Presente, as a response to that call. We are present. Here we are, not only in the field and in the classroom or in a museum gallery, but also in the streets with the movements. Presente as a radical, alive, nomadic archaeology, delinked from the suffocating associations with essentialist notions, static identity concepts, or commodification and capital. An archaeology which, in front of linearity and teleology of progressivism, will always be out of line, deeply affective and out of order at the same time. An archaeology which always comes from the future. And thank you very much for your patience and you listening.
Obrigado, professor Yannis.
Thank you, Professor Hamilakis.
Mais uma vez, então, muito obrigado pelas palavras.
I would like to thank you once more for your presentation. We started our conference last Sunday with a conference on archaeology of the present by Professor Gavua from Ghana. And now we hear from you your perspective on the same topic, closing this conference. We are very glad to see that archaeology is no longer based only on those objects that we get from the past. It's also present with this future perspective, which is very interesting for all of us, especially in Brazil. We could comment on many aspects, of course, and we've got a few questions here. But there is one thing I see in what you say about the mystification of archaeology. In Brazil, we have one mystification that is very strong and in a way encouraged, such as a way of disseminating it to the audience in general. I really think we have to demystify this archaeology, and I'd like to answer this. How is it possible? How can we do an unmystified archaeology?
Thank you for that, and I'm very glad that you had also the opening talk on the archaeology of the present. So we come full circle at the end of your conference. Now, I spoke about mystification with reference to one specific application in archaeology, DNA analysis, and how very often we are presented with the results in a kind of black boxing kind of procedure that we do not really, even ourselves as archaeologists, understand what has been happening in the analysis, let alone the public, let alone others who are outside the discipline of archaeology. So I said that mystification in that DNA kind of phase of archaeological work is in fact something that perhaps is also intended on the part of some specialists there, because it adds to the authority, adds to the kind of feeling of awe and amazement that the public often feels. Here's my sample of my DNA, and you will tell me who I am. So I think we share, however, a different view, and we say that we want to get rid, as you said, of that mystifying power that very often analytical techniques have. And I think there's been already a lot of work in other areas of archaeology to try and counter the mystification. The community archaeology projects in Brazil. I know there are many in other parts of South America, in other countries. There are many attempts to not only show results, and I think that's key. In community archaeology, we need not just show the results, but also show the process, explain to people how we reach specific results, explain to people how we actually work. And I think this is something that the public needs from us. Very often they ask us, how do you know these things? How come you've actually dug here and not elsewhere? How come you are able to say these things to us? So they are very often more keen on the process and how we got to understand these things ourselves than factual information about the things we excavate. So I put to you that intensifying our community archaeology efforts and focusing on the process of producing knowledges as well as the results is crucial and important. And we can think of other practices and ways, but I agree with you that it's crucial that we actually do work on that mystification.
Obrigado, Yannis.
Thank you, Yannis. We've got a question and a comment from Alejandra Saladi, who says, politicians tend to erase by nature. And local population, was it heard? Did this population say what they wanted, they wished?
Do you mean in my example, in the example of Moria?
Exatamente.
Okay.
Yes, exactly.
It's a very complicated matter here, because the closest village to the camp it was mostly, not in total, but mostly hostile to the camp itself. They suddenly, it's a small village of 1,000 people, around 1,000 people, and suddenly they saw a camp of 20,000 people at its highest, 20,000 people, 20 times to the size of their village, next to them, with no facilities, with segregation, with horrible conditions, and with all the effects of that kind of process of segregation, and especially during the COVID lockdown. So hostility actually developed, and I think many of them were glad when the camp was burned down. And as far as I know, there hasn't been any move on their parts to memorialize that camp, to maintain the memory of it, to create some sort of exhibition or something to talk about it. So because of that hostility, it's difficult for us now, for example, for me or for other colleagues, to go and say to those people, we need to memorialize this, because for them it's a facet of their recent history that they would rather not engage. Now, I have to be careful, not everybody thinks that, of course, but I'm talking about the largest kind of sector of the population in the local village. In the town of Mytilene, which is the nearest big town, several kilometers away, there are communities, there are smaller NGOs and others who actually want to continue working on that and on the memory of the camp as well. But at the same time, they have to think about the new camp, which in terms of its conditions, especially surveillance, is actually worse. So people do not have now lots of the things that they had in the old camp. So it's a matter of prioritizing. Shall I work with people in the new camp to make their life a bit better, or shall I focus on memorializing and talking about the old camp that burned down? And they prioritize, I think rightly, the conditions in the new camp. I, on the other hand, as an archaeologist, I believe I need to do both. My job is to actually treat that site as an archaeological site and talk about it, because, as I said, there is a lot to be learned from it. So it's not just a matter of creating a memorial for the sake of it. It's a matter of producing knowledge out of the history of that place. So I guess, have the time and some of the resources and the academic ability and skills to do the work of remembering and memorialization and discussion like we do in this session now. My colleague activists on Lesbos focus right now on working with the inhabitants in the new camps.
Obrigado.
Thank you.
Thank you. Another question from Jacqueline Santos. She says, very powerful, your presentation. I thank you for all the connections. I'd like to hear a little bit about whether in the Anthropocene, the future of archaeology would be to think about the future of ruins.
Yeah, it is a very interesting question, a very important question as well, because as we know, we are in a moment of climate emergency, and we know that very well. I made a brief mention to it, but obviously I did not elaborate. And I think we can connect that to the archaeology of migration in a very direct way, because as we know, Today, for example, on Lesbos, most migrants flee war, persecution, poverty. Increasingly, many people, including in the global north, will be actually fleeing climatic change and climatic emergency. So it's a kind of an archaeology and a concern that is going to be more and more kind of pertinent and important in the years to come, unfortunately, in the future. Now, whether we our destiny is to work on the ruins of the Anthropocene, I would say two things to that. The first is that the ruin as a concept has lots of interesting kind of connotations and can be very, very, very interesting and powerful to think through, but it can also have other connotations that are not necessarily hopeful and important and illuminating. So I'm thinking increasingly that another concept I want to work with is the concept of remains, not ruins. So by remains, we evoke the sense that things last, that things have been, they are still here, they are left because of this, but that duration, the ability of matter to last, gives us hope that they can become the beginnings of something else. So remains are more hopeful than ruins. My second point is that we shouldn't study only remains or ruins. For example, we could also study the material edifices of specific regimes in the present. So when I was in Moria, when the Moria camp that you saw was still in operation, I was not just studying what is left behind from people, I was also studying as much as I could what was built by the authorities. So the new materiality of detention, how the camps were constructed, how the barbed wire was actually used to regulate specific bodily movement. So you could even study standing buildings that are not ruined yet, but they are going to be ruined, as we know, as Moria was. But in their operation, they're important for us to understand because, as we know, materiality and buildings and architecture shape human experience, shape behavior. So you could understand a lot about what kind of humans the authorities of that camp wanted to produce. I think docile, mostly subjugated and docile humans is the answer, because you could see how the lines for food, for example, were constructed so that people could be there waiting online for food for hours and hours on end. So think of that process of space that produces waiting and how that waiting regulates human behavior and human experience and human memory and can have specific social effects. So yes, we have to study remains and ruins, but also we have to study standing operating buildings, I think, because these are the ones that shape human experience today.
When I hear what you're saying now, and I'm evoking the images in your presentation, I was wondering whether the remains and the ruins were already removed, because many of the images are very clean, as if they had been stripped. Where are the ruins? Where have they gone?
Well, first of all, yeah, that's a good point. I haven't thought of that, but some of it had been removed. Yes, so when I went and photographed this, it was, I would say, 2 weeks after the fire. So I would say that there are 2 or 3 things happening. The first is that these people do not really produce the plentiful and abundant materiality. They are not into consumerism the way that we are, for example. So it's not that there were so many things there that now have been removed. That was the one. So there were fewer things compared to what you would see, let's say, in a house today on the island, in the house of a person who lives permanently in Mytilene or another place. The second is that they did take some things with them. they took as much as they could in terms of their personal belongings. So some of these were removed by the inhabitants during the fire and before the fire. So they cleaned up some of it themselves. And then, of course, scavenging happened as well. Other people may have gone over there to collect. Although, as I said, the big scavenging kind of process in Moria was for metal, for scrap metal. And there was very little in terms of scrap metal in the facility, in the tents and the kind of the facilities in the shelters I actually photographed and did. But it's interesting what you say, because there was rain as well, heavy rain for a day or two. So that actually cleaned some of the small, but there was a lot still. I mean, maybe it's not shown very clearly in the photo, but there was still lots of small things. And I was able to collect some. You saw the photo, for example, with the blue paint, the acrylic paint from the art studio. That was still there. The burnt cases of brushes were still there. The white ash from the library was still there, the books that they were burned. So, yeah.
Obrigado.
Thank you.
Thank you. Juliana Freitas says, thank you for your words, important reflections, and social, political, and sensorial sensitivity. And in the first part of your presentation said that our sense of temporality is loaded of politics. Could you please mention other examples of this same phenomenon in archaeological practice?
Yeah, I think, Julia, you're referring to the point where I said that our sense of linear developmental temporality, the notion of time as an arrow, as a train journey that most of us were taught to follow. I said that it has also political implications. So it has epistemic implications on how we do archaeology, because it separates past and present. It talks about, but it also has political implications. So I refer to 2 or 3 political implications. Although, as I said, there's a lot we could collectively think about. So one political implication is the idea of escapism, that archaeology, for some people who believe that kind of separation is an escape into the past, is kind of provides I guess, a refuge, if we're talking about refugees and migrations, a refuge from contemporary life. And that I understand. For some people, of course, it's a need. And we know that sometimes what we live today is overwhelming. So for some people, to live, inverted commas, in the world of the Bronze Age is a relief, right? You escape in the Bronze Age because it's too much to cope with what's happening today. So that escapism is a need for some people, and I cannot argue with that need, but you can also see it as an abdication of responsibilities in some way, that we work in the present, and even the Bronze Age is present today in many different expressions, be it, how it's presented in museums, how it's evoked in by art, how it's actually evoked by people who choose specific symbols or specific images for their own purposes. So it's not really impossible to do that escapist journey, even if you wanted to. So a political effect of that abdication of responsibility is to not examine how the knowledge you're producing yourself in the present operates, what kind of stories it tells. For example, in the third point I mentioned about developmental narratives and cultural evolutionism, how we go from tribes, clans, tribes, chiefdoms, states, all that kind of terminology and typology of evolutionism. If we are to continue reproducing it and not consider how does that operate in the present, what kind of stories does it produce, that's another abdication of responsibility. That's another kind of escapism and kind of an attempt to avoid political consequences. Because, as I said, to still believe in that narrative, to still believe and reproduce this terminology, you actually produce a story that's not just about the past, it's also about the present. You're describing how history works. You're describing how societies work in the past and how they continue working together. So that is not an innocent narrative. That's a story that actually is teleological, and that's a story that is foreclosed, a story that does not allow alternative scenario about the present and the future to be put forward. So these are some of the examples where the chronopolitics of archaeology can have political effects. You know, when you actually say, I don't really care about, you know, this because I work on the Bronze Age, or I work on the Neolithic, or I work in the formative period of this, or, you know, a specific Andean archaeology kind of context. You know, I can understand the need, as I said, but I don't think that's possible today to do. And I think it shouldn't be possible because, as we said, we live in a multi-temporal, our experience is multi-temporal, whether we want it or not.
Obrigado. Maria
Thank
Cecília.
you. Maria Cecilia Coelho says, it's paradoxical to watch films such as the one by Angelo Polos that denounces the terrible problem of migration and asylum seekers. I thought that a film could lead people to become to develop solidarity. What kind of actions can move people and not only build memories?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I like the reference to Angelopoulos' film. I guess it shows movement, migration in previous kind of decades in Greek history. And I think solidarity, as you were saying, is a key kind of process that we need to work with and to work on. I don't want to give the impression that there is no solidarity at all, and there are organizations, there are groups already. So there are people both on the island of Lesbos, in Greece as a whole, and also in many other countries in Europe, in the US, in other countries that actually engage in solidarity actions. And that's helpful. It's not that we are actually facing exclusively xenophobic and racist behaviors and attitudes. We do see also solidarity moves. How can we increase that? How we can make that stronger and better? I think we can do lots on that in many different ways. One way is by actually explaining the processes of movement and explaining how and why these people move, understanding the causes, explain to people that these people are not really here to, steal your job or steal your benefits, or to, they are fleeing very often. They're on the move because they want to build a new life because of the conditions they left behind. Talk about the histories of the world that involve migration all the time. Archaeology can be great help here because we study mobility in the long term, as we know. So we can use also some of our stories about mobility in different periods to show that there's rarely been a static society, a society with no movement, no mobility. So mobility is central to human experience. We do face increased mobility today because of specific conditions. Historical archaeologists also can do a lot in connecting contemporary migration with the histories of colonization, colonialism. Many of the people who come to Europe today from countries in Asia and in Africa are coming from countries who were colonized by the European powers, or who are involved in recent neo-colonial experiments, such as Afghanistan, which is a case where many people are coming to Greece from right now. People from Africa are coming from West Africa, many of the French colonies of West Africa. They come from the British colonies in Italian colonies in Eastern Africa. So you see, as I said, a continuation of that long process of extractive colonization. And now the people who were colonized and who saw their countries ruined, by many processes, not just by colonization, but colonization was key and central. They're coming and saying, here I am, remember me, here I am, and I want a stake. I want to be part of your presence. I want to be part of your society. And we know that the state and the European Union, and also states like the US and other states, treat them as criminals. So I guess we can do a lot as archaeologists, both as part of our archaeology in the present, the things I do and others do, but also as part of the archaeology of other periods, by showing mobility in the long term and by showing the histories of colonization. I hope I answered.
Obrigado.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Maria Teresa Parente
Maria Teresa Parente says,
fico na dúvida sobre a fronteira
I don't know. What should I do? Between interpret contexts as archaeological sites, and B, interpreting these same contexts based on contemporary process of space occupation. When do reoccupation processes can no longer be thought about as archaeology and have to be thought about as vandalism?
That's a tricky and an interesting and a nice question, and I appreciate that a lot. I've been thinking a lot about concepts such as vandalism, in fact, and the last time I thought about that concept was when I was writing a short piece for a magazine, online magazine, on the defacement of monuments of the Confederacy in this country as part of the Black Lives Matter. As you may remember, there was lots of destruction of statues, of monuments in the US, in Britain, and there was a group of people, some historians too, who said this is vandalism because these are historical monuments. And I could see why they were taking that position. But if you were to study the history of the creation of these monuments, you could see that they were created at specific moments in the history of each country. For example, they were created as a weapon when African Americans in this country were gaining power. They were actually, being a force in the public arena. They were actually staking their claims in the political life of this country. And as a response, conservative groups that actually, have racist and other ideas wanted to establish statues that would celebrate the Confederacy, a kind of a cause that links directly to slavery. So in that case, you couldn't talk about vandalism. You could talk about people, in fact, intervening in monuments that have been constructed as specific weapons in the ongoing struggle and battle involving slavery, involving race, involving racism. Now, I know that is different from the case that the colleague who asked the question meant, the case of, let's say, an archaeological site, when you have different people passing through or occupying that site and leaving traces. I have worked with sites, let's say classical sites, which have traces of other periods in it. The question is, when do we start calling a trace not a palimpsest, but an act of vandalism? That's very subjective. And I think that relates to what do we valorize, what kind of moments do we valorize. For example, in Greece now, if you have a classical monument and you have a Byzantine church on the top of it, both are considered monuments. Both are considered part of the history of the place. So there should be a concern to study both of them, although classical heritage takes priority because of its position in the national mythology and national ideology of the country. Now, if you don't have a Byzantine church, but have something more recent, like a 19th century building, is that a monument or not? Is that something that needs to be preserved? I would take the view that all three of them have importance. All of them talk of human experience and action, and that there should be a way to actually preserve the memory, the material memory of all three of them, without necessarily declaring that I care about the classical or I care about the Byzantine. This is 19th century or even early 20th century, right? I know that not everything can be preserved, not everything can be, rescued as is. But that's different from saying I'll erase all these things because they're vandalism and I'll keep the other because they're monuments. So what is a monument and what's not, as we know, changes through time, and it's very subjective. So if we take, as I do, the view that all human experience leaves interesting material traces that provide information and potentially can be very illuminating, then you don't get trapped into specific narratives about prioritizing, let's say, the classical, the prehistoric, or other periods, depending always on the broader kind of national or other mythologies. So I can't give you a specific answer because I don't know the context that you work, the colleague who asked the question, but these are just broader thoughts for the sake of our discussion.
Obrigado. Nós vamos fazer uma
Thank you very much. Now we will have the last question asked by Marcela Marques. How does art potentiality takes place as existential narratives? I didn't get the question in Portuguese. I hope you did.
No, I didn't actually. So could you repeat that?
Ok. Ela pergunta assim: como se dá a potencialidade da arte enquanto ou qual a potência da arte como uma narrativa existencial?
Okay, now I get it.
Okay.
How powerful is art as an existential narrative?
Okay. I guess that is a comment to my last image I showed you with the artist from Argentina producing that very interesting and very affective piece. I think the answer to it is that it can be extremely powerful. And there have been works of contemporary art that have deeply affected me, and I'm sure many other people too. And not only that, but they've also provided sources of inspiration for me to develop archaeological, anthropological, and other concepts in my theoretical work. So I do not see contemporary art as just decoration. I see it as a point of departure for reflection, for thinking about theoretical concepts that are also about archaeology. Because if you think about it, artists also work with materials like us. They engage with matter, and very often ideas about time are also central to their own thinking. So they are cultural producers in the similar sense that we are cultural producers. So we share lots in common with contemporary arts. And for me, sensoriality, how they evoke the sensorial, and affectivity, how they become deeply affective, touching, are key concepts in the experience and the appreciation of contemporary art. That's just a short answer, but the answer is definitely it can be extremely powerful. Not always, of course, but it can be very powerful. And I think it is in domain. Archaeologists have actually done a lot on contemporary art, as we know, and they collaborate. And it's something that I always try to do in my own excavations, invite contemporary artists and have an ongoing dialogue in terms of how we do our process and how they do theirs. And very often they get inspired by what they see to do their own artwork that then feeds back into what we are thinking about the site.
Ok, muito obrigado, professor.
Thank you very much, Professor Yannis, for accepting our invitation to discuss not only with the members of SAB, but also for raising these so important questions for Brazilian archaeology. We have here many comments, still many questions, but we do not have time. We have to close our conference. And thank you very, very much. We hope next time we'll meet face to face as in the first time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for listening. Thank you for the very engaging and very interesting questions. And I too would love next time to be with you in person and talk and also, socialize and kind of be, in a collegiate and an interesting kind of context. So thank you again and take care. And I hope your final meeting goes very well.
Grande abraço. Tchau.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye bye.
And thank you to Sieni for the translation.
Thank you, Professor. It was a pleasure and an honor.
Thanks. Bye.
Now, let's have our brief closing ceremony of this intense week. You've seen that although we went through many hardships throughout these last 2 years, we will. Professor, are you there?
Ao longo dessa semana muito intensa de trabalho, a gente pode perceber que o Congresso foi um sucesso, sim, é tudo isso, é tudo que as pessoas falam para nós. E eu tenho aqui alguns números, né, algumas coisas sobre o Congresso que eu acho que é importante, né, a gente conversar sobre isso. Inicialmente, é bom saber que a gente já vem preparando o Congresso desde o início do ano, né, e que a gente obteve uns 695 inscritos, né, para participarem do evento, dos quais 299 foram sócios efetivos e colaboradores, 38 como estudantes, e tivemos também uma grande inscrição de não associados, com um número de 358. É interessante notar também a distribuição espacial, né? A gente tem aí a maioria dos inscritos em ordem, sendo de Minas Gerais, São Paulo, Pará, Rio Grande do Sul, né? Muitas propostas de trabalho, ou seja, 409 trabalhos foram enviados, quase todos aprovados, 395 com aprovação. E o importante talvez seja, inclusive, pensar nas interações. Ao longo dessa semana, nós tivemos registrado na plataforma, no YouTube, mais de 6.000 interações, ou seja, mais de 6.000 pessoas conversando, mandando seus coraçõezinhos, as palmas, e manifestando a sua presença nas mesas e compartilhando com os colegas. Lógico que um congresso como esse, que é pelas mídias, que vai ter material ainda disponível nas redes, a gente vai continuar ainda tendo números, repercussões, mais pessoas assistindo, né, aos vídeos. A gente teve assim uma programação bem intensa nesses dias, né, ou seja, 5 conferências, 5 mesas redondas, 41 simpósios temáticos, foi um número bem significativo de simpósios, né? E um número de 248 apresentações orais, né? Só nos simpósios, né? Porque, além disso, ainda tivemos 31 apresentações orais avulsas nas mesas, né? Os posters não ficaram atrás, 67 pessoas enviaram seus posters, que estão lá no site, ainda dá tempo de ver, corre lá para ler os trabalhos, tem trabalhos bem legais, assim como os lançamentos de livros, 6 lançamentos de livros e 5 obras audiovisuais que eu pessoalmente assisti e recomendo. Vão lá, que é um outro conteúdo, né? Alguns deles, os trabalhos também foram apresentados nas mesas, nos simpósios temáticos. Acho que agora revê-los talvez seja até a gente tem até uma outra perspectiva. assim, em termos totais, a gente teve 52 horas de transmissão, né? O pessoal aqui da equipe já me informou que a média por dia era de 90 gigas de informação que foi transmitida, né, para todos aí que acompanharam. Então, reforçando, na plataforma a gente teve mais de 4.000 autenticações, ou seja, 4.000 pessoas se autenticaram ao longo dessa semana. No YouTube já temos mais de 3.000 visualizações, né? E uma média de 200 pessoas para assistir cada vídeo que está lá. Ainda na semana do Congresso, então o alcance que a gente vai ter com os vídeos, né, na plataforma ainda podem ser bem maiores. E eu não posso deixar de agradecer tudo isso que ocorreu aqui. Ele só ocorreu por conta da comissão organizadora, né? Adriano, Marcela, Anne, o Clyde, o Chumbinho, o Eduardo, que, né, dentro dessa gestão estava aí diretamente envolvido nesses meses árduos de produção do evento. Mas também os 62 membros da comissão científica foram fundamentais para a qualidade dos trabalhos apresentados. A assessoria de comunicação, na figura da Glória Tega, foi importantíssima para que essas informações chegassem para nós, chegassem para todos aí e que fosse um sucesso participar do evento. Assim como não dá para deixar de elogiar o trabalho da coordenação de organização do Congresso, da Irene Sanches de Oliveira, que pôde, então, contribuir muitíssimo para que tudo isso saísse bem organizadinho. É lógico, a gente sempre tem que ter paciência, é uma modalidade nova, mas os problemas que tivemos foram muito poucos. Às vezes eu fico pensando que foi menos até do que problemas quando a gente tem um congresso presencial. A gente sabe que, às vezes, as dificuldades são de cada os lugares onde está. Nós tivemos bastante dificuldade porque nós, muitas vezes, não pudemos deixar o nosso trabalho, não tivemos mais justificativa que a gente ia para outra cidade para poder participar do congresso. Mas também foi fundamental todo o trabalho aí que a gente teve da equipe, né, da equipe técnica da empresa Giga, que gentilmente aqui estava junto a cada mesa. Vocês tinham um técnico, nós tínhamos 7 técnicos para cada atividade que estava acontecendo. Então, eu acho que todos foram muito bem atendidos nas suas dificuldades, e a gente tinha uma estrutura gigantesca, aí, como vocês podem ver na foto, mais de 15 computadores. Algumas desses técnicos estavam trabalhando aqui com a gente mais de 12 horas por dia, durante todos os dias do Congresso. Então, fizemos tudo com muito carinho, muita atenção, para que os problemas fossem resolvidos o quão mais rápido. Então, eu fico muito feliz de fazer o encerramento aqui, pensando exatamente na lógica que estava na cabeça de todo mundo. A gente tem que fazer essas dificuldades, a gente tem que fazer esse novo, tudo que é mais difícil, virar uma oportunidade, e virar uma oportunidade de criar a possibilidade da gente ter uma inovação no Congresso, uma novidade, e que talvez algumas inovações que a gente trouxe aqui, algumas inovações que nós conquistamos, talvez sejam necessárias até para os congressos presenciais no futuro, já que nós colhemos frutos muito positivos. E eu já falo que nós não paramos por aqui, né? As conferências, as mesas redondas continuam lá no YouTube. Ainda é possível vocês assistirem e usufruírem do material disponível. Então, eu só tenho a agradecer a todas, a todos, a todes pela participação. Sei que muita gente fez um esforço muito grande para assistir o conteúdo, para participar, para mandar perguntas. Então, muito obrigado, e a gente se vê no próximo Congresso da SAB.